The rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Kensington flat did not fall so much as it blurred, a greyish wash that turned the London skyline into a smudge of charcoal and dampened slate. Inside, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone lingering from the cooling espresso machine. Elias sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, his fingers tracing the microscopic fibers of the fabric. His heart was not racing in the way the poets described it. It was thudding with a heavy, rhythmic dread, a dull ache that seemed to vibrate in his marrow. In the kitchen, the sound of glass clinking against marble indicated that Clara was moving, her actions sharp and punctuated by a frantic kind of energy. They had just finished the same argument they had been having for 3 years. It was a carousel of grievances, a closed loop of hurt that started with a perceived neglect and ended with a deluge of apologies that never quite managed to take root in the soil of change. As Elias sat there, he felt a profound sense of somatic exhaustion. His breathing was shallow, his diaphragm tight, as if his body were bracing for an impact that had already occurred. He was a man who lived in the world of data and neurological patterns, a researcher who spent his days mapping the firing of synapses. Yet here he was, trapped in a biological feedback loop he could describe perfectly, but could not seem to escape. He heard her footsteps approaching. They were soft, hesitant, calculated. This was the beginning of the reconciliation phase, the part of the cycle where the jagged edges of their conflict were buffeted by the soft waves of her contrition. When she sat beside him, the scent of her perfumed jasmine and something darker, like bruised fruit, filled his nostrils. It was a scent that usually signaled safety, but today, it felt like a chemical trigger for a false sense of security. "Elias, I am so sorry," she whispered, her hand moving to rest on his forearm. Her touch was warm, but he felt a phantom chill run down his spine. "I never meant to make you feel like you do not matter. I was just stressed. I was overwhelmed. I cannot lose you. You know you are everything to me." He looked at her, really looked at her, peeling back the layers of his own affection to see the mechanism beneath. In the clinical silence of his mind, he began to dissect the moment. The words she used were perfect, calibrated to soothe, yet they lacked the essential weight of empathy. There was a fundamental distinction, he realized, between the fear of loss and the presence of love. In the laboratory of their relationship, he was witnessing the frantic firing of the sympathetic nervous system. Clara was not reacting to his pain. She was reacting to the threat of his absence. When a human being truly loves another, the neurological architecture is clear. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of complex thought and moral decision-making, aligns with the mirror neuron system. When one partner suffers, the other's brain mirrors that distress. It is a visceral, involuntary response driven by oxytocin, the hormone of bonding and protection. To love someone truly is to feel their wound as a breach in one's own skin. It creates a biological imperative to stop the hurt, to alter one's behavior, not out of a fear of consequence, but out of a fundamental inability to witness the other's agony. But what Elias felt coming from Clara was different. It was the high-frequency hum of anxiety. Her pupils were dilated, her breath quick, her skin slightly flushed. These were not the markers of empathetic sorrow. They were the markers of a system in flight or fight mode. She was D'ing him, as the old saying went, soothing him, coddling him, smoothing over the cracks, but she was not changing. She was not changing because the root of her distress was not his unhappiness, but the potential destabilization of her own life. He thought about the concept of the selfish ego. In the hierarchy of human motivation, the fear of losing a resource, emotional, social, or physical, is one of the most powerful drivers of behavior. To Clara, he was a vital component of her homeostasis. He provided the stability, the intellectual stimulation, and the social scaffolding that allowed her to function at her peak. If he left, her world would contract. Her fear was not for him, but for the version of herself that existed in his presence. It was a calculation of personal utility disguised as a romantic devotion. "Is that so?" Elias asked, his voice low and devoid of the usual warmth she used to anchor herself. You say you cannot lose me, but you have done the very thing I told you breaks me 5 times in the last month. You say I am everything, yet when I am speaking of my needs, your brain is already formulating a defense. You are not listening to my pain, Clara. You are listening for the moment I might decide to walk away, so you can prevent it. She flinched, her fingers tightening on his arm. That is not true. How can you be so cold? I am here, am I not? I am apologizing. I am trying. But you are not trying to change the cause, he countered, his mind flashing to a slide of a brain scan showing the lack of activity in the empathetic centers during a narcissistic defensive reaction. You are trying to manage the symptom. You are deeing the child so it stops crying. But you are not fixing the hunger that made it cry in the first place. This is the difference between pity and compassion, between attachment and love. One is about keeping the object, the other is about cherishing the person. He pulled his arm away slowly, the movement feeling like he was tearing through thick, invisible glue. The somatic sensation of the relationship had become one of consumption. He felt as though he were being slowly dissolved in the acid of her need. Every time they went through this, a little more of his vitality was siphoned off to fuel her equilibrium. He was being used as a stabilizer for a woman who did not actually see him as a separate entity with his own internal landscape. To her, he was a function. He remembered a study he had read on the neurobiology of grief versus the neurobiology of social rejection. When people lose someone they love, the brain processes it as a loss of a part of the self that we becomes an integrated identity. But when people fear losing someone they are merely attached to for ego-driven reasons, the brain processes it as a threat to status or safety. The distinction was subtle but profound. Clara's brain was currently in a state of ego preservation. She was bargaining with the universe to keep her world intact. I'm not a person to you, Clara, he said, the realization tasting like copper in his mouth, bitter and sharp. I am a habit. I am a comfort. I am a mirror that reflects the best version of you. You don't want to lose the mirror because without it, you have to look at the wall. And the wall is empty. She began to cry then. But the tears did not move him. He watched the way they tracked down her cheeks, noticing how she angled her face toward the light. A subconscious performance of vulnerability. He felt a wave of nausea, a physical rejection of the theatricality of her grief. True sorrow is messy. It is uncoordinated. It is a collapse. Her grief was a tool. It was the ultimate lever to move him back into his place in her orbit. This is the neurological trap, he thought. The victim of this kind of fake love is often held hostage by their own empathy, because he had the capacity for true zot, that deep, visceral ache for another's pain. He had spent years interpreting her reactive anxiety as genuine love. He had seen her tears and assumed they were shed for the same reasons his would be. He had projected his own capacity for empathy onto her void. But the data did not lie. The repetition of the hurt was the evidence. If the oxytocin and the mirror neurons were truly engaged, the behavior would have shifted long ago. The brain is plastic, but it requires the genuine stimulus of empathy to rewire the pathways of habit. Without that spark of true care for the other, the person simply reverts to the path of least resistance once the threat of loss has subsided. They soothe, they promise, they perform. And then they return to the same selfish patterns, because those patterns serve their own internal needs. He stood up, the movement making his head swim for a moment. He looked down at her, seeing the way she looked up at him, her eyes wide and pleading. It was the look of a predator who had lost its grip on its prey, or a child who had dropped a toy. It was not the look of a partner who had realized they were destroying the person they cherished. You were being cruel, she sobbed, her hands clenching into fists. After everything I've done for you, after how much I've given. He smiled, a thin, pained expression that did not reach his eyes. What have you given, Clara? You have given me the things that made you feel good to give. You have given me the parts of yourself that you wanted me to admire. But you have never given me the one thing I actually needed. The willingness to put your own ego aside long enough to actually see me. You have never felt zot for me. You have only ever felt fear for yourself. He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slick streets of London. Below, the red buses moved like slow, glowing beetles through the dark. He felt a strange lightness beginning to spread through his limbs, a decoupling of the heavy chains that had bound his nervous system to hers. It was the first stage of a long, painful detoxification. For too long, he had mistaken her frantic D for a promise of change. He had allowed himself to be pacified by words that were nothing more than neurological noise designed to maintain the status quo. He had been a participant in his own consumption, a willing victim of the illusion of being loved. But the analytical mind, once it sees the pattern, cannot unsee it. The data was in. The hypothesis of her love had been tested and found wanting. He thought about the millions of people caught in this exact loop. The ones who stayed because the D was so sweet, because the performative concern felt so real in the moment of crisis. They were the ones being slowly hollowed out, their own empathy used as a weapon against them. They were the ones living in a state of chronic depletion, wondering why they felt so lonely in the presence of someone who claimed they couldn't live without them. The truth was a scalpel. It was sharp, it was cold, and it was necessary to cut away the necrotic tissue of a false relationship. To love someone is to be their guardian, not their consumer. To love someone is to have a neurological stake in their well-being that transcends one's own convenience. Clara stood up, her voice dropping the high pitch of hysteria and taking on a low, jagged edge. Fine. If you want to be this way, if you want to throw everything away over a few mistakes, then go. See if anyone else will put up with your constant overanalyzing. See if anyone else will love you the way I do. There it was, the final reveal. The shift from I love you to nobody else will want you. It was the classic move of the ego-driven attachment. If you cannot be controlled by affection, you must be controlled by fear. The mask had slipped, and beneath it was the raw, pulsing engine of her own insecurity. She didn't want him to be happy. She wanted him to be hers. I think I would prefer to be alone than to be with someone who considers my destruction a fair price for their comfort, he said softly. He turned away from the window and looked at the flat. It was a beautiful cage, filled with objects they had chosen together, but it lacked the one thing that made a home, the safety of being truly seen. The sandalwood scent now felt cloying, like the smell of a funeral parlor trying to hide the scent of decay. He realized that he had been living in a mausoleum of their potential, mourning a relationship that had never actually been a partnership. The silence that followed was different from the silence after their arguments. It wasn't a pregnant pause waiting to be filled with apologies. It was a terminal silence. It was the sound of a system shutting down. Clara watched him, her expression shifting from anger to a chilling kind of blankness. She was already beginning to recalibrate, her mind lightly scanning for the next source of stability, the next mirror to hold up to her face. She was a creature of survival, and he was a resource that had become too expensive to maintain. As he walked toward the door to get his coat, he felt the rhythm of his own heart. It was steady now. The shallow breathing had deepened. He was no longer in a state of hypervigilance. He was stepping out of the loop. He was choosing to stop being consumed. The journey out of a relationship like this is not a single leap, but a series of painful, conscious steps. It is the process of reclaiming one's own nervous system from the grip of another's ego. It is the hard work of learning to value one's own peace over the addictive highs and lows of a false intimacy. Elias opened the door. The air from the hallway was cooler, smelling of damp concrete and the city's indifferent bustle. It was an honest smell. "You'll be back," she said from the shadows of the living room, her voice devoid of emotion. "You always come back." Not this time, Elias thought, though he didn't say it aloud. This time, the data is complete. This time, I have seen the ghost in the machine. He stepped out, and as the door clicked shut behind him, the sound was not a slam, but a punctuation mark. The first part of his life, the part defined by the erosion of his soul, was over. The rain outside was still falling, but as it touched his skin, it didn't feel like a grey wash of despair. It felt like a cleansing. He walked toward the lift, his footsteps echoing in the corridor, each one a heartbeat, each one a declaration of independence from a love that was nothing more than a well-disguised hunger. The realization sat in his stomach like a cold stone. He had been loved as a possession, cherished as a utility, and protected as an investment. But he had never been Zot. He had never been truly pitied for his pain or held in the quiet, selfless sanctuary of a heart that wanted nothing from him but his own flourishing. That kind of love, the kind that heals rather than consumes, was still out there, somewhere beyond the grey blur of the London rain. And for the first time in a very long time, Elias felt he was finally moving toward it. He stepped out into the foyer, the concierge nodding to him with a polite, distant professionalism. The world was moving on, indifferent to the quiet tragedy that had just unfolded on the 14th floor, and that was exactly what he needed. He needed the world to be big again. He needed to be small in a way that didn't involve being diminished. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors of the building and stepped onto the pavement, the wind caught his coat. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, expanding his chest, breaking the last of the somatic tension. He was no longer being de-ed. He was no longer being managed. He was simply existing, a biological entity finally free of a parasitic bond. The streetlights reflected in the puddles like fallen stars, shattered and shimmering. And for the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the need to fix them. He just watched them shine. The pavement beneath his boots was a slick mosaic of oil sheen and grit. Elias walked without a destination, his body moving on a primitive autopilot, while his mind began the arduous task of deconstructing the architecture of the last 3 years. The cold rain was no longer a nuisance. It was a tactile reality that anchored him to the present moment. He could taste the metallic tang of the city air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating, curated sweetness of the flat he had just vacated. It was the taste of iron and exhaust, of damp brick and the collective breath of millions. It was the taste of the world as it actually was, unfiltered by the expectations of a woman who demanded the universe bend to her aesthetic. His heart, which had been a frantic bird trapped in a ribcage for months, began to find a more rhythmic, percussive cadence. The tightness in his trapezius muscles, a chronic knot he had come to accept as part of his anatomy, started to thrum with a dull, releasing ache. This was the first stage of the decompression. He was like a diver rising too quickly from the depths. He had to be careful not to let the nitrogen of his repressed emotions bubble in his blood and kill him. He needed to surface slowly. He found himself in a small, late-night cafe tucked away in a side street near Marylebone. The windows were steamed up, blurring the golden light from within into a hazy, indistinct glow. As he pushed the door open, a bell chimed, a thin, tinny sound that felt remarkably honest. The air inside was a thick soup of roasted beans, burnt milk, and the faint, yeasty scent of warming bread. It was a sensory overload that felt like a homecoming. He sat in a corner booth, the cracked vinyl of the seat sticking slightly to his damp trousers. The waitress approached, her face a map of long shifts and quiet entrance. She didn't offer a performative smile. She offered a menu that was stained with coffee rings and a glass of water that tasted faintly of chlorine. Elias ordered a black coffee. He wanted the bitterness. He wanted something that didn't hide its nature behind sugar or cream. As he waited, he pulled his phone from his pocket. It felt heavy, a piece of surveillance equipment that had been used to track his emotional state for 1,000 days. There were 3 missed calls, 2 messages. He didn't open them. He knew the contents without looking. The first would be a demand for an explanation, phrased as a concern for his well-being. The second would be a subtle jab at his instability, a reminder that he was the one who was difficult, the one who was breaking the pact. He looked at the device and saw it for what it was, a digital umbilical cord through which Clara fed him her anxieties and drained him of his autonomy. He turned it off. The screen went black, reflecting the overhead fluorescent light as a single, cold spark. The silence that followed was internal. The coffee arrived, steaming and dark. He wrapped his hands around the ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into his palms, chasing away the chill of the rain. He took a sip. The liquid was scalding, a sharp prickle on his tongue, that forced him to focus on the physical sensation of swallowing. He felt the warmth travel down his esophagus, a glowing line of heat in the center of his chest. This was the first time in months he had tasted something without wondering if it met someone else's approval. He began to audit the relationship with the cold precision of a forensic scientist. He looked at the memories not as sentimental keepsakes, but as data points in a long-term experiment on human endurance. He remembered the dinner parties where he had been expected to perform a specific version of himself, the supportive, intellectual foil to her radiant, mercurial center. He recalled the way she would subtly correct his posture or his choice of words in front of others, not with a direct reprimand, but with a look of pained disappointment that was far more effective. It was a form of psychological pruning. She had been cutting away the parts of him that didn't fit her garden, until he was nothing more than a topiary, shaped by her shears. He leaned back against the vinyl, watching a drop of condensation run down the window. He thought about the word zot. In his mother's tongue, it was a word that carried the weight of true empathy, a visceral ache for the suffering of another. Clara had never felt zot for him. She had felt inconvenience. She had felt frustration when his depression or his exhaustion interfered with the image of their life. She had treated his pain a technical glitch in a system that was supposed to run perfectly for her benefit. When he had lost his father the previous year, she had held him, yes, but even in that embrace, he had felt the clock ticking. He had felt her waiting for him to finish the mourning process so they could return to the business of her life. She had offered him a curated sympathy, a performance of grief that was more about how she looked as a grieving partner than about his actual loss. He remembered the smell of her perfume that day, the sandalwood again, and how it had made him feel nauseous, a cloying layer of artifice over the raw, jagged hole in his soul. He took another sip of coffee. The bitterness was comforting now. It was a truth. He began to realize that his own role in the relationship had been one of profound cowardice. He had allowed the erosion to happen because he was afraid of the void. He had traded his identity for the illusion of stability. He had been a co-conspirator in his own disappearance. The analytical part of his brain, the part he had tried to drown in her drama, was now re-emerging, blinking in the light. It was telling him that the love he thought he was losing was never actually there. You cannot lose what you never possessed. He had been in love with a projection, and she had been in love with a mirror. The cafe was quiet now. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of a bus on the wet road outside. Elias felt a strange sensation in his gut, a fluttering that wasn't anxiety, but a dormant spark of curiosity. For the first time in years, he didn't know what he was going to do tomorrow. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like oxygen. The absence of a plan was the presence of a self. He thought about his old flat, the one he had kept as a storage space, but never quite let go of. It was a small, dusty studio in a less fashionable part of the city. It smelled of old books and floor wax, not sandalwood. He had the keys in his coat pocket, a heavy brass weight that he had carried like a secret. He would go there. He would sleep on the floor if he had to. He would inhabit a space that didn't require him to be anyone other than a man who had survived a shipwreck. As he stood up to leave, he felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. It was a phantom limb sensation, a conditioned response to the act of leaving her. His brain was firing old signals, telling him he was being cruel, that he was abandoning someone who needed him. He paused, his hand on the back of the chair, waiting for the wave to pass. He analyzed the guilt. It wasn't based on an objective harm he was causing. It was based on the script she had written for him. In her narrative, his departure was a betrayal. In his narrative, it was a rescue mission. He paid the bill, the coins clinking on the counter with a definitive, metallic finality. Outside, the rain had slowed to a fine mist that hung in the air like a veil. The city felt different now, less like a hostile landscape and more like a vast, complex organism of which he was a small, independent part. He began to walk toward the tube station, his pace steady. He noticed things he hadn't seen in years. The intricate carvings on the cornices of the old buildings, The way the light from a kebab shop window turned the pavement into a glowing amber sea. The smell of wet earth from a small window box. He was experiencing a sensory reclamation. Every smell, every sound, every texture was a piece of himself he was finding again. He reached the station and descended the escalator, the mechanical hum vibrating through the soreness of his feet. The air in the underground was warm and smelled of ozone and ancient dust. He stood on the platform, watching the tunnel for the first sign of the train's lights. When it arrived, the rush of wind pushed against him, a physical force that felt like a challenge. He stepped onto the carriage, found a seat, and closed his eyes. He imagined his own mind as a hard drive that was being defragmented. The scattered files of his identity, his interests, his memories, his quiet preferences were being moved back into their proper places. The sectors that had been corrupted by her influence were being marked as empty space, ready to be written over by something new. By the time he reached his old flat, the sun was beginning to bleed through the grey horizon, a pale, watery yellow that didn't so much light the world as reveal its exhaustion. He climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under his weight. When he turned the key in the lock, the sound was a revelation. It wasn't the smooth, silent click of her expensive door. It was a mechanical struggle, a resistance that required effort. The flat was cold. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of neglect. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains, letting the grey dawnlight spill across the floorboards. There was a thin layer of dust on everything. He ran his finger across the surface of a small wooden table, leaving a clean trail in the grey film. It was his dust. It was his silence. He went to the kitchenette and turned on the tap. The pipes groaned and shuddered before a stream of rusty water sputtered out. He let it run until it turned clear and cold. He splashed his face, the shock of the temperature making him gasp. He looked at himself in the small, spotted mirror above the sink. He looked older. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, and a certain hollowness in his cheeks. But his eyes were different. The hypervigilance was gone. The constant, scanning fear of saying the wrong thing or being the wrong way had evaporated. He looked like a man who had just come through a long fever. He looked like a man who was finally, painfully, awake. He found a clean towel in a cupboard, the fabric stiff and smelling of lavender sachets that had long since lost their potency. He dried his face, the rough texture of the cotton stimulating his skin. He felt a profound sense of physical presence. He was here. He was alone. He was safe. He spent the next few hours in a state of quiet, methodical activity. He stripped the old sheets from the bed and found a set of clean ones. He opened the windows to let the city air circulate, replacing the stale smell of the past with the fresh, damp scent of the morning. He found a small radio in a box and turned it on, tuning it to a station that played classical music. The notes of a cello filled the room, deep and resonant, a sound that didn't demand an emotional response, but simply existed in the space. He sat on the edge of the bed and forced himself to breathe. He analyzed the impulse. This was the trauma bond at work. This was the neural pathway she had worn into his brain, the one that equated her distress with his responsibility. He looked at the urge as if it were a biological specimen. It was a survival mechanism that had outlived its usefulness. He didn't need to fix her. He didn't need to save her. He only needed to sit still until the feeling passed. He focused on the sensations in his body. His stomach was tight. His palms were sweating. His heart was racing. He didn't try to suppress these feelings. He simply observed them. I am experiencing a withdrawal from a toxic emotional system, he told himself. This is a predictable physiological response. It will peak, and then it will subside. He stayed there for an hour, a lone figure in a dusty room, fighting the ghosts of 1,000 arguments and a million subtle manipulations. Slowly, the heart rate slowed, the sweat dried, the urgency faded into a dull, manageable ache. He had survived the first wave. He got up and walked to the bookshelf. Most of his books were still at her flat, but a few remained here, the ones he hadn't been able to fit into the curated life she had built for him. He pulled out a volume of poetry. The paper yellowed at the edges. He He opened it at random and read a line. The soul has bandaged moments. He felt a sudden, sharp sting in his eyes. He hadn't cried during the breakup. He hadn't cried in the rain or in the cafe. But now, in the quiet of his own space, the tears came. They weren't tears of rage or even of sadness. They were tears of relief. They were the sound of the ice breaking. He sat on the floor, his back against the bookshelf, and let the grief wash over him. He grieved for the time he had lost. He grieved for the version of himself he had allowed to be killed. He grieved for the man who had been so afraid of being alone that he had accepted a life of being invisible. The crying was a somatic purge. With every sob, he felt a layer of tension leave his body. He felt the sandalwood scent finally being washed out of his pores. He felt the weight of her expectations being lifted from his shoulders. He was becoming lighter. He was becoming translucent. When he finally stopped, the room was bathed in the bright, unforgiving light of midday. The dust motes danced in the sunbeams, a chaotic, beautiful display of entropy. He felt exhausted, but it was a clean exhaustion. It was the tiredness of a soldier who had finally reached the end of a long march. He stood up and went to the window. Below, the street was alive with the mundane business of a Saturday morning. People were walking their dogs, carrying bags of groceries, laughing, arguing, living. The world hadn't stopped because he had left her. The universe hadn't collapsed. It was a humbling and liberating realization. He was not the center of her world, and she was not the center of his. They were just a people who had collided and then drifted apart, leaving behind a trail of emotional wreckage that would eventually be swept away by the tide of time. He felt a sudden, sharp hunger. It was a physical demand, a sign that his body was beginning to reassert its needs. He went to the kitchenette and found a tin of soup in the back of a cupboard. He opened it, the smell of tomato and basil filling the small space. He heated it on the old stove, the blue flame flickering with a steady, comforting hiss. He ate the soup standing up, the warmth spreading through his body. It tasted like survival. It tasted like the beginning of something. He spent the afternoon cleaning. He scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and wiped down the shelves. He moved with a deliberate, mindful focus, treating every action as a ritual of purification. He was reclaiming his territory. He was marking his boundaries. By evening, the flat felt different. It was still small and old, but it was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary. The air was fresh, the surfaces were clean, and the silence was no longer heavy with the weight of things unsaid. It was a fertile silence, a space where new thoughts could grow. He sat by the window as the sun began to set, painting the London skyline in shades of violet and bruised orange. He felt a sense of profound stillness. The analytical part of his brain was still working, but it was no longer a weapon used to defend himself against her. It was a tool he was using to build a new map of the world. He thought about the concept of love. He realized that he had been conditioned to believe that love was a struggle, a constant negotiation of needs, and a perpetual sacrifice of self. He had seen it as a zero-sum game where one person's happiness was always bought at the expense of the others. But now, in the quiet of his own room, he saw that this was a lie. True love wasn't a hunger. It was a feast. It wasn't a cage. It was a horizon. He hadn't found that kind of love yet, but for the first time in his life, he felt capable of looking for it. He was no longer a broken man seeking a repair kit. He was a whole man, however scarred, who was ready to be seen. He looked at his phone, still sitting dark and silent on the table. He picked it up and, without hesitation, dropped it into a drawer. He didn't need it tonight. He didn't need to know what she was thinking or what she was doing. He didn't need to be the recipient of her carefully crafted dramas. He went to the bed and lay down, the clean sheets cool against his skin. He listened to the sounds of the city, the distant rumble of a train, the siren of an ambulance, the muffled voices of people on the street. They were the sounds of life, in all its messy, uncoordinated glory. As he drifted towards sleep, he felt a final, lingering sensation. It was the smell of the rain on his skin, faint but unmistakable. It was a clean smell. It was an honest smell. It was the smell of a man who had finally found his way home, not to a place, but to himself. The system was no longer shutting down, it was rebooting. The data was being processed, the errors were being corrected, and the new operating system was being installed. It was a system based on peace, on autonomy, and on the simple, radical act of being truly seen by one's own eyes. Elias closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he slept without dreaming of her. He slept the deep, restorative sleep of the liberated. The ghost in the machine was gone, and in its place was a man, breathing steadily, waiting for the dawn. The next morning, the light was different. It wasn't the grey, oppressive light of the previous day, but a sharp, clear brilliance that made every detail of the room stand out. Elias woke early, his mind alert and clear. He felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. He dressed in clean clothes, the fabric feeling fresh against his skin. He felt a new kind of physical confidence, a sense of being grounded in his own body. He wasn't walking on eggshells anymore. He was walking on solid ground. He went out to a local market, the air filled with the vibrant smells of fresh produce and spices. He bought apples, bread, and a small bunch of wildflowers. He enjoyed the simple act of interacting with the vendors, the brief, polite exchanges that required nothing more than common courtesy. He was a person among people, not a satellite orbiting a demanding sun. When he returned to the flat, he placed the flowers in a glass jar on the table. They were simple and unpretentious, but they brought a splash of color to the room. He sat down and began to write. He didn't write about her, or about the relationship. He wrote about the things he had seen that morning: the light on the buildings, the smell of the market, the feeling of the wind on his face. He was reclaiming his voice. He was telling his own story. The analytical depth he had once used to navigate her minefield was now being turned toward the world. He observed the patterns of life around him with a new curiosity. He saw the beauty in the mundane, the complexity in the simple. He was no longer a man trapped in a loop. He was a man moving forward, one step at a time. As the days passed, the urge to contact her grew weaker. The withdrawal symptoms subsided, replaced by a steady, quiet strength. He began to reconnect with old friends, people he had drifted away from during the years of his isolation. He found that they were still there, waiting for him, their warmth and acceptance a soothing balm for his bruised ego. He realized that he had been living in a state of emotional poverty, and that the world was actually a place of great abundance. There was so much to see, so much to do, so much to feel. He felt like a man who had been blind and was now seeing the world in full color for the first time. One evening, he was walking in a park near his flat. The sun was setting, and the trees were casting long, elegant shadows across the grass. He saw a couple sitting on a bench, talking quietly. They weren't performing for anyone. They were simply being together, their presence a quiet, mutual support. He watched them for a moment, not with envy, but with a sense of recognition. That was what he wanted. Not the drama, not the intensity, not the curated perfection, just the quiet, honest safety of being seen. He continued his walk, his footsteps light on the path. He felt a sense of profound gratitude. He was grateful for the pain, for the struggle, for the eventual collapse, because without it, he would never have found the strength to leave. He would never have found the courage to be himself. He looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the deepening blue. He felt a sense of connection to the vastness of the universe. He was a small part of it, yes, but he was a part of it nonetheless, and that was enough. He returned to his flat, the light from the street lamps reflecting in the windows. He felt a sense of peace that was deep and unshakable. He was no longer a resource to be managed, an investment to be protected, or a utility to be used. He was a man, free and whole, and the world was wide and full of possibility. He sat at his table and began to read. The words on the page were clear and resonant, their meaning unfolding in his mind like a flower. He was no longer reading through the lens of someone else's expectations. He was reading for himself. The silence of the flat was no longer empty. It was full of his own thoughts, his own memories, his own dreams. It was a space that was entirely his own. He knew that there would be difficult days ahead. He knew that the grief would return, and that the scars of the past would never entirely disappear. But he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever came. He had survived the shipwreck, and he had reached the shore. He was no longer being de-ed. He was no longer being managed. He was simply Elias. And for the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. He looked at the flowers on the table, their petals soft and vibrant in the dim light. They were a reminder that even in the midst of neglect and decay, beauty could still flourish, and so could he. He turned off the lamp and went to bed, the quiet of the room a gentle embrace. He fell asleep quickly, his breath steady and even, a man who had finally found his own rhythm in the vast, indifferent, and beautiful world. The first light of the following Tuesday arrived not as a shock, but as a slow, grey invitation. Elias lay still, his head denting the cool linen of the pillow, listening to the muffled rhythm of the city waking up outside his window. There was no immediate surge of adrenaline, no frantic mental rehearsal of the day's potential landmines. The air in the room was thin and carried the faint, metallic scent of a London morning, damp pavement, distant exhaust, and the sharp, clean smell of the eucalyptus branches he had placed in a vase on the windowsill. He inhaled deeply, feeling the air expand his ribcage, noting the absence of that familiar, restrictive tightness that had once felt like a permanent iron band around his chest. He rose and walked to the kitchen, his bare feet meeting the cold parquet floor. The sensation was grounding, a tactile reminder of his own physical presence into a space that no longer required justification. He filled the kettle, the sound of the running water echoing in the silence. It was a domestic sound, mundane and beautiful. He watched the water swirl, a miniature vortex of clarity. As the kettle began to hum and then roar, he felt the vibration in the counter beneath his palms. He was hyper-aware of his senses now, as if the years of emotional suppression had acted as a thick veil that was finally being stripped away. He made tea a strong, malty Assam. He didn't rush. He watched the dark liquid bleed into the hot water, a slow-motion explosion of amber. He added a splash of milk, watching the clouds of white swirl and settle into a pale, creamy tan. The first sip was hot, almost scalding, the bitterness of the tannins drying his tongue before the warmth spread down his throat. It was a singular experience, unshared and unmonitored. He wasn't checking his phone to see if a message had arrived to dictate his mood. He wasn't calculating the exact tone he would need to use when he eventually spoke. He was simply a man drinking tea in the quiet of his own life. The analytical part of his brain, once a weapon used for survival, was now a tool for appreciation. He looked at the way the light caught the steam rising from the mug. He considered the physics of it, the heat transfer, the way the light refracted through the vapor. He thought about the architecture of his own recovery. It was like retrofitting an old, crumbling building. The facade remained, but the internal structures, the beams, the joists, the very foundations were being replaced with something sturdier, something designed to withstand the weight of his own existence, rather than the demands of someone else's. He found himself in a large, Victorian-era library, a cathedral of hushed whispers and the scent of aging paper and floor wax. He sat at a long oak table, the surface scarred by decades of pens and elbows. He opened a notebook. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the surface slightly toothy. When he began to write, the scratching of the nib was a rhythmic, soothing sound. He wasn't writing to explain himself to her anymore. He was writing to map the territory of his own mind. He wrote about the concept of the void. For years, he had believed that the emptiness he felt was a deficiency in himself that only she could fill. He now realized that the void was not a hole to be plugged, but a space to be inhabited. It was the space where his own thoughts could grow, where his own desires could take root. The de-ed state, he realized, was a form of psychological colonization. She had moved into the empty spaces of his psyche and built a fortress, convincing him that he was the invader in his own home. Now, he was reclaiming the land, brick by brick, thought by thought. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of a dinner they had shared a year ago. He could almost taste the wine sour, expensive red that had left a film on his teeth. He remembered the way she had looked at him over the rim of her glass, her eyes narrowed, her voice a low, melodic weapon, as she dissected a minor flaw in his character. He remembered the somatic response, the way his stomach had curdled, the way his hands had gone cold, the way he had felt himself shrinking until he was nothing more than a collection of apologies. He observed the memory now with a clinical detachment. He saw the mechanics of the manipulation, the way she used silence as a tether, the way she offered affection as a reward for compliance. He felt a wave of pity, not for her, but for the man he had been. He saw that man as a survivor of a slow-motion shipwreck, someone who had clung to a jagged rock because he was afraid of the open sea. But the sea, he now knew, was where the freedom lay. He left the library as the afternoon light began to fail, turning the sky a bruised purple. He walked toward the river. The air was colder here, smelling of salt and wet stone. He stood on the embankment, watching the dark water churn against the pillars of the bridge. The sound was a low, constant thrum, a white noise that drowned out the lingering echoes of her voice in his head. He felt the spray on his face, tiny pinpricks of cold that made him feel intensely alive. He saw a woman standing a few yards away, leaning against the railing. For a heartbeat, his pulse spiked. The silhouette was similar to the tilt of the head, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud. His breath hitched, the old panic rising like bile in the back of his throat. He waited for the collapse, for the desperate urge to run toward her or away from her. But then, he looked closer. He used his analytical mind to break down the image. The coat was the wrong shade of navy. The height was off by an inch. The way she held herself was different. There was no tension, no performed elegance. She was just a stranger looking at the water. He felt the panic recede, replaced by a cool, steady calm. The physiological reaction had been a ghost, a residual spark in a nervous system that was still learning that the war was over. He breathed through it, feeling his heart rate slow, his muscles loosen. He didn't need to flee. He didn't need to hide. He was safe in the fortress of his own skin. He continued his walk, crossing the bridge. The lights of the city were beginning to flicker on, a constellation of artificial stars, reflected in the dark mirror of the Thames. He felt a sense of immense scale. He was one person among millions, his story a single thread in a vast, intricate tapestry. This thought didn't make him feel small. It made him feel connected. He was no longer the sole inhabitant of a claustrophobic universe built by two people. He was a citizen of the world. He stopped at a small grocery shop on his way home. The smell inside was a riot of earthy sweetness, ripe tomatoes, dusty sacks of potatoes, the sharp tang of lemons. He picked out a head of garlic, feeling the papery skin crinkle under his thumb. He chose a bunch of basil, the scent bruising into the air, spicy and green. He was buying these things for himself. For a meal he would cook exactly how he liked it. There would be no critique of the seasoning, no heavy silence if the pasta was a minute overdone. Back in his flat, the ritual of cooking became a form of meditation. He chopped the garlic, the rhythmic click of the knife against the wooden board a steadying beat. He watched the oil shimmer in the pan, the garlic sizzling and turning a pale gold, releasing an aroma that filled the kitchen with warmth and comfort. He added the tomatoes, watching them break down into a rich, bubbling sauce. He tasted it, the brightness of the acid, the depth of the olive oil, the heat of a pinch of chili flakes. It was a simple, honest flavor. He ate at the small table by the window, the only sound the clink of his fork against the plate. The food was nourishing, a physical manifestation of the care he was finally giving himself. He realized that for years, he had been starving not for food, but for the simple dignity of being allowed to exist without conditions. He was no longer being soothed into submission. He was awake. The clarity was sometimes painful, like the sting of antiseptic on a raw wound, but it was a clean pain. It was the pain of healing. The act of deleting it felt surprisingly light. It was a digital severance that mirrored the internal one. He felt a sudden, kinetic energy, a desire to move, to do, to be. He went to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a stack of old photographs. He looked through them, seeing the versions of himself that had existed over the years. There he was at university, bright-eyed and idealistic. There he was at his first job, nervous and eager. And then, the photos from the last few years. In those, his smile didn't reach his eyes. His posture was guarded, as if he were constantly bracing for an impact. He took those photos, the ones from the years of the shipwreck, and put them in a box. He didn't throw them away. They were part of his history, the scars that proved he had survived. But he moved the box to the back of the wardrobe, into the shadows. They no longer needed to be on display. They were the records of a previous life, a closed chapter. He returned to the window and looked out at the city. The night was deep now, the sky a dark, velvet canopy. He felt a sense of profound stillness. The frantic searching, the desperate need for validation, the constant calibration of his own soul had all stopped. He was like a pendulum that had finally found its center. He thought about the future. For the first time, it didn't look like a long, exhausting corridor of more of the same. It looked like an open field, shrouded in mist, perhaps, but full of potential paths. He didn't need to know where they led. He only needed to know that he was the one choosing the direction. The analytical depth of his mind turned one last time toward the concept of love. He realized he had confused intensity with intimacy, and control with care. True intimacy, he saw now, was not the merging of two people into a single, suffocating entity. It was the meeting of two whole individuals, each respecting the boundaries and the sovereignty of the other. It was a quiet, steady light, not a blinding, destructive fire. He felt a surge of gratitude for his own resilience. He had been broken down to his very atoms, and yet, here he was, reassembling himself into something new. He was the architect of his own recovery, the author of his own story. The words he had written earlier in the library came back to him. He was reclaiming his voice. The silence of the flat was now a companion. It was the silence of a forest at night, full of unseen life, of growth, of the slow, steady work of nature. He felt a deep, somatic sense of ease. His breathing was slow and regular, his heart a steady drum. The phantom weight on his shoulders had vanished, replaced by a lightness that made him feel as if he could float. He went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. He looked at himself in the mirror. He saw the lines around his eyes, the grey at his temples. He saw a man who had been through a war and had come out the other side. He didn't look for her reflection in his eyes anymore. He only saw himself. He turned out the lights, one by one. The flat fell into a soft, layered darkness. He climbed into bed, the sheets cool and crisp against his skin. He felt the weight of his own body, the solid reality of his existence. He wasn't waiting for a phone to buzz. He wasn't listening for a key in the lock. He was Elias. He was a man who had been lost and was now found, not by someone else, but by himself. He was a man who had been dead into a coma, and had finally, gloriously, woken up. As sleep began to pull at the edges of his consciousness, he felt a final, lingering thought. It was a sense of wonder at the sheer, beautiful complexity of being alive. The world was wide, the stars were distant and bright, and the morning would come again, bringing with it 1,000 new possibilities. He closed his eyes, and the darkness was not a threat, but a warm, enveloping peace. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, his breath a quiet, rhythmic prayer to the simple, magnificent fact of his own freedom. When he woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the gap in the curtains, drawing a bright, golden line across the floor. He lay there for a moment, basking in the warmth. He felt a hunger not just for breakfast, but for the day itself. He wanted to feel the wind, to hear the sounds of the street, to see the way the light hit the old brick buildings. He got out of bed and stretched, his muscles singing with a newfound vitality. He went to the kitchen and opened the window. The air was crisp and smelled of autumn dry leaves and wood smoke. He leaned out, looking down at the street. People were moving, cars were passing. The world was in its usual, chaotic motion. He felt a sense of belonging that was deeper than anything he had ever known. He was a part of this. He was a participant in the grand, messy, beautiful experiment of life. He was no longer an observer, no longer a ghost haunting his own existence. He made coffee this time, the scent dark and roasted, filling the room with a sense of purpose. He drank it standing up, looking out at the sky. It was a clear, pale blue, vast and indifferent. He liked the indifference. It meant the world didn't need him to be anything other than what he was. It didn't demand a performance. It didn't require a sacrifice. He spent the morning working, his mind sharp and focused. The analytical patterns that had once been used to predict her moods were now directed toward complex problems, toward creation, toward understanding the world. He found a deep satisfaction in the work, a sense of flow that made the hours disappear. He was no longer working to distract himself. He was working because he had something to contribute. In the afternoon, he went for a long walk in the park. He saw the same couple from a few days ago, sitting on the same bench. They were holding hands, their bodies tilted toward each other. He felt a quiet joy for them. He didn't feel the sting of his own loneliness, because he wasn't lonely. He was solitary, and there was a magnificent difference. Loneliness was a lack, solitude was a fullness. He sat on a different bench and watched a dog chasing a ball, its ears flapping, its tongue lolling in a paroxysm of pure, unadulterated happiness. He laughed a short, bright sound that surprised him. It was the first time he had laughed out loud in a long time. It felt good. It felt like a release of the last few drops of poison. He stayed in the park until the shadows grew long and the air turned cold. He felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a devastating collapse had reached its destination. He wasn't the same man who had started the journey, and he was glad of it. That man was a shadow. This man was substance. He walked back to his flat, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. The city was humming with the energy of the evening. He felt a sense of profound peace, a quiet, unshakable strength. He was no longer a resource to be managed, an investment to be protected, or a utility to be used. He was a man, free and whole, and the world was wide and full of possibility. He entered his flat and closed the door. The click of the lock was a final, satisfying sound. He was home, not just in this physical space, but in himself. He was the master of his own silence, the captain of his own soul. He sat at his table and looked at the notebook he had been writing in. He picked up the pen and wrote one final sentence. It wasn't an explanation, or a justification, or a plea. It was a simple, declarative statement of fact. I am here, and I am enough. He closed the notebook and set it aside. He felt a sense of immense lightness, as if he had finally set down a heavy burden he had been carrying for a lifetime. He looked around the room, at the flowers, the books, the soft light of the lamp. Everything was in its place. Everything was as it should be. He spent the evening in a state of quiet reflection. He didn't feel the need for distraction. He didn't need the television or the internet to fill the space. He was content to simply be. He felt a sense of connection to everything around him: the wood of the table, the fabric of the chair, the air in the room. He was part of the fabric of the universe, a single, unique thread, vibrating with the energy of existence. As the night grew late, he felt a gentle tiredness. It was the tiredness of a day well lived, a body well used. He went to the bedroom and prepared for sleep. The ritual was simple and focused. He brushed his teeth, the minty taste sharp and refreshing. He washed his face, the cool water a soothing touch. He climbed into bed and pulled the duvet up to his chin. The room was dark, the only light the faint glow from the street lamps filtering through the curtains. He felt a sense of profound safety. There were no ghosts in the corners, no echoes in the silence. He thought about the word D one last time. It was a word that belonged to a different language, a different life. It had no power here. It was a spent force, a faded memory. He felt a surge of love, not for a person, but for life itself, for the struggle, the pain, the recovery, and the eventual peace. It was all part of the same beautiful, terrifying, magnificent whole. He closed his eyes and felt himself drifting. The last thing he felt before sleep claimed him was the steady, even rhythm of his own heart. It was a strong, persistent beat, a constant reminder of his own vitality. He was Elias. He was alive. He was free. And in the vast, indifferent, and beautiful world, that was more than enough. It was everything.